On a March morning in 1943, a 19-year-old girl stood on a cold painted floor in Liverpool and realized she had just predicted her own brother's death. She had no war medals and no command rank. She only had chalk, a stopwatch, and 8 months of running convoy battles on the floor of a basement that smelled of damp concrete. But every time she played those games, the same thing happened. British escorts chased German submarines, gaps opened, and convoys died. Her brother's destroyer had followed those same tactics and vanished with all hands. At this moment, I want you to imagine standing where she stood. Would you walk away, or would you pick up the chalk and prove that the doctrine followed by every admiral in the room was wrong? Because in the next 47 minutes, this teenager was about to do something impossible. She would sink an admiral's convoy, force the Royal Navy to change how it fought, and make German U-boats die 3 times faster. Janet arrived at Derby House before the sun climbed over Liverpool. The building always felt half asleep at that hour. Silent hallways, cold stair rails, and the familiar scent of damp paint drifting up from the basement. She walked down the narrow steps into the pit, the large open room where the painted floor showed a map of the North Atlantic. The colours were faded from constant use. Chalk dust gathered in corners. Wooden ship models waited in small trays. The room felt colder than usual, as if the night still clung to the concrete walls. She had barely slept. Her mind had repeated the same pattern through the night. A loop of numbers, distances, timings, and the bright line at the bottom of the telegram she had received the day before. It said her brother's destroyer was lost with all hands. It listed the date, the convoy number, and the location where the ship disappeared in the dark. She had read the words so many times that her eyes could no longer separate them. They became a single block of meaning, a heavy shape she could not set down. Captain Roberts was already in the pit, writing on a clipboard while a small heater hummed weakly behind him. He looked up when she entered. His expression shifted, not to pity but to something quieter, as if he understood that pity would break her more than the telegram had. He asked if she wanted to step out for a while. She said no. Her voice came out steady, almost calm. She told him she needed to work. She needed to finish the simulation they had started yesterday. That response surprised him, but he nodded. He had seen her determination many times before. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, focused. The type of determination that settles in the bones. Janet walked to the edge of the painted ocean. The room held a soft echo that always made her footsteps sound slower than they were. She took the chalk from a nearby tray and knelt to redraw a grid line that had smudged overnight. The white line cut across the blue paint like a thin scar. The officer she was training that morning, Lieutenant Morrison, arrived a few minutes later. He greeted Roberts with polite confidence and nodded at Janet with the same slight doubt she had seen on many faces the past 8 months. He did not mean to insult her. He simply did not believe that a 19-year-old girl could understand war better than someone who had been at sea. Roberts explained the scenario again. Morrison would command a group of escort destroyers guarding a convoy of merchant ships. Janet would play the German submarines. The rules were simple. Movements were measured in time. Attacks were marked with chalk. Nothing was decorative. Everything represented something real. That was what made the pit powerful. It was not a toy. It was a slow, cold mirror of the ocean outside. The game began. Morrison spread his escorts in a wide arc around the convoy. Confident in the traditional method he had been taught, his formation looked almost perfect at first glance. Even spacing, steady movements, strong search patterns, the type of formation older officers praised. Janet studied the pattern with the same calm she had used hundreds of times. She did not rush, she observed. She watched where he placed his lead destroyer, how he shifted the outer ships when he felt pressure, how long each unit stayed away from the convoy when he sent them to investigate. After 20 minutes, she moved her first submarine marker into view. She placed it exactly where she knew Morrison would see it. Predictability was one of the strongest tools a U-boat commander used. When Morrison reacted, he reacted with confidence. His destroyer rushed forward toward the exposed submarine. He believed that chasing danger meant preventing it. He did not realize that every step he took away from the convoy pulled apart the protective ring around the merchant ships. Janet watched the gap open in the formation. The moment it widened, she placed another submarine in position. This one represented a hidden attacker. It slipped toward the merchant ships, while Morrison concentrated on chasing the first marker. He had seen this scenario unfold many times, and he knew where it would lead. The chalk marks slowly multiplied. Red pieces appeared beside several merchant ships, and Morrison's expression changed. His jaw tightened. His confidence wavered. After 40 minutes, the convoy was bleeding red. The escort line had collapsed into scattered shapes that no longer protected anything. When the simulation paused, Morrison shook his head and muttered that it did not feel realistic. He insisted that real submarines did not behave exactly like this. Janet did not argue. She simply asked how many convoys he had escorted in the past 7 months. He hesitated before answering. 4. She asked how many he had lost. He looked toward the floor. Several. She wanted to tell him that her brother had died in the same pattern, following the same doctrine, chasing a submarine that had already escaped. She wanted to say it plainly, but the words felt like hot metal in her throat. Instead, she said the only thing that mattered. She told him that leaving the convoy to chase submarines created openings that German commanders counted on. She told him that aggressive pursuit felt brave, but acted like a knife, cutting holes in the screen meant to save the merchant ships. She told him that she had run this same pattern 8 times, and the result had never changed. The truth finally settled on Morrison's face. He understood. Not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the weight of his decisions, enough to know something was wrong with the rules he had trusted. By the time the session ended, Janet's chalk-covered hands trembled slightly. She stood up, brushed her palms together, and looked across the pit. In her mind, she saw the convoy her brother had sailed with. She saw the same gaps, the same choices, the same pursuit, the same end. She realized something important at that moment. Reports, charts, and recommendations were not enough. Officers needed to feel the failure in real time. They needed to watch their own convoys die before they believed change was necessary. Something bigger had to happen. Someone higher had to see it for themselves. That thought settled in her mind as completely as any equation she had ever solved. She would make an admiral enter the pit, and she would sink his convoy too. When Janet first arrived at Derby House in July 1942, she had no idea that the building was the center of the fight for Britain's survival. The war at sea felt distant to most people. Something happening far away in cold water where ships vanished without a sound. But inside this old command center, every wall carried tension. Every map pinned with tiny flags marked a convoy that might survive or disappear before morning. Janet walked through the entrance with her small suitcase, expecting to be given clerical work or simple duties suited for a young woman with no naval background. What she found instead changed the entire direction of the war. She was led down to the basement, where Captain Gilbert Roberts stood beside the enormous painted floor map that stretched almost wall to wall. He pointed out the chalk grids, the wooden ships, the markers for submarines, and the boxes of stopwatches arranged neatly on a table. Then he explained what the Western Approaches Tactical Unit really did. The Wrens, the young women assigned there, played the role of German submarines in full-scale war games. Real naval officers played the escorts. Every movement was timed. Every attack followed documented German patterns. Every mistake led to consequences. Roberts told her she had been chosen, not in spite of her lack of naval experience, but because of it. Officers who had served for decades carried habits formed by tradition. They relied on methods that worked against surface ships, but collapsed when used against submarines. He wanted people with no old ideas in their minds. People who could see patterns without the distraction of pride or routine. When he said this, he looked directly at her and added that her mathematics background made her an ideal fit. His confidence startled her, but it also strengthened her. She accepted her role and began studying captured German tactics the same day she arrived. She spent hours reading about wolfpack strategies, shadowing distances, night attacks on the surface, and the way submarines coordinated silently across miles of ocean. The more she learned, the more she realized how predictable British escorts had become. German commanders counted on that predictability. They used it as a tool to draw ships out of formation. Her first simulation took place on July 15th. She was nervous, but determined. The room filled with officers who had fought in earlier battles and believed they could read the ocean like a book. Some respected the idea of wargaming. Others treated it like an interesting diversion. None imagined that a 19-year-old woman would expose flaws in their doctrine with a few chalk lines on a painted floor. Commander Harrison was chosen to take the escort position. He had over 30 years at sea and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had survived battles other men had not. Janet watched him study the map, checking convoy speed, weather conditions. She placed her first submarine far from his line of sight, just as she had seen in the German manuals. The game began with Robert's calling time. She moved slowly, tracing the path her lead submarine would take to shadow the convoy without revealing itself too soon. Harrison deployed his escorts exactly as the textbooks recommended. Wide arc, aggressive searching, constant movement on the outer screen. It looked impressive. It also looked familiar. Janet had studied these patterns and knew where the weaknesses lay. When she allowed her lead submarine to be spotted, Harrison reacted by sending 2 escorts racing toward it. She timed their departure. She watched the gap open in the defensive wall. She placed her second submarine at the edge of that gap. Her third followed soon after. The fourth waited, circling like a hunter that knows the prey will soon be exposed. Within minutes, her submarines penetrated the formation. She moved them inside the convoy ring and began marking attacks. Roberts recorded the results quietly. Red markers appeared beside merchant ships as the simulated torpedoes struck. Harrison tried to respond, but every movement he made created more open space for Janet to exploit. By the end of the game, 12 merchant ships were marked as destroyed. All 4 of her submarines survived. Harrison had not sunk a single attacker. The silence afterward felt heavier than the cold air around them. Harrison stood at the edge of the map, staring at the damage. His frustration grew quickly. He insisted that the scenario was unrealistic. He claimed that no submarine could break through his screen so cleanly. He argued that the chalk model did not capture the chaos of real sea combat. Janet waited for him to finish. She did not raise her voice or defend herself loudly. She simply pointed to the casualty reports Roberts had shown her earlier. Those reports contained details of real convoys devastated by the exact formations Harrison had used. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence carried weight instead of anger. The truth sat between them. Harrison did not want to believe it, but he could no longer deny it. Janet had demonstrated something he had not seen from the deck of his ship. He had been trained to chase submarines, to hunt aggressively, to leave the convoy temporarily when the chance to destroy the enemy appeared. He had never realized that the pursuit itself was the trap. German commanders expected that reaction. They planned around it. Roberts repeated the simulation with adjusted tactics. This time, Harrison kept his escorts tight around the convoy. He did not chase the exposed submarine. He held his line. The effect was immediate. Janet could not find a path inside. Her submarines circled without opportunity until she was forced to retreat. When the simulation ended, no ships were lost. The lesson was clear. But the challenge ahead was enormous. They would need to retrain thousands of officers, each accustomed to decades of tradition. Reports alone would not change minds. Only the pit could do that. Only by feeling the consequences of their decisions would officers accept that their own doctrine was destroying their convoys. Janet understood this better than anyone. She had seen the proof again and again. What she did not yet know was that the most important test was still approaching. The war outside was growing more desperate. Convoys were failing at an alarming rate, and one of those convoys, carrying her brother, was sailing straight into the trap she had warned about for months. Convoy SC-121 left Halifax on the 15th of February, 1943. 59 merchant ships carried fuel, grain, steel, and every supply Britain needed just to stay alive. 9 escort destroyers guarded them, including the ship where Janet's brother served as an anti-submarine warfare officer. Waves rolled high enough to hide entire ships for seconds at a time. The convoy slowed to hold formation. Escorts struggled to keep contact with one another. It was the kind of crossing that tested even the strongest crews. Janet did not know every detail of the journey while it happened, but she understood the pattern. She had seen the same sequence play out again and again in the pit. When visibility dropped, German submarines used the darkness as cover. They shadowed the convoy from behind or from the sides, slipping just close enough to track speed and course. Alone, a U-boat could do little, but a wolfpack could turn a night of bad weather into a slaughter. The reports that reached Derby House in late February confirmed exactly what she had feared. On the 24th, the first German submarine sighted the convoy. It sent a contact report. Others followed. The submarines began spreading out, forming a loose semicircle around the merchant ships. They did not rush in. They waited. They watched for the same mistake British escorts always made. When a single submarine finally rose to the surface and let itself be seen, one of the escorts reacted immediately. It charged forward to attack, leaving its position in the defensive ring. Another destroyer soon followed. They chased the submarine through the darkness, trusting the doctrine that had been repeated in training for years. They believed that hunting the enemy meant saving the convoy, but Janet already knew what that decision created. A gap, a hole in the protective ring wide enough for another submarine to slip through unnoticed. And at that moment in the Atlantic, submarines were already waiting for that opening. By nightfall, the wolfpack moved in. Torpedoes flashed underwater trails. Explosions broke across the horizon like distant lightning. Merchant ships lit the sky with burning cargo. Men who had been eating their evening meal minutes earlier now struggled in freezing water while flares drifted overhead. In the chaos, escorts tried to regroup, but every time they moved toward one flare or one distress signal, another gap opened somewhere else. Janet learned these details slowly over the following days, piece by piece, through official transmissions and after-action reports that arrived with heavy stamps and tired handwriting. But one message struck harder than all the others. It arrived on the morning of March, first while she was standing in the pit, preparing another simulation. Roberts carried the envelope. He did not speak at first. He simply held the telegram as if it weighed more than paper should. She knew before opening it. Her hands trembled, but she forced her eyes to read every word. Her brother's ship, HMS Hesperus, was lost with all hands after chasing a submarine that escaped beneath the waves. There were no survivors. There was no location where the families could mourn. The ocean had taken everything. Janet felt the world narrow to a single point. The room around her became silent, even though officers moved nearby. Her breath stayed tight, unable to settle. Roberts asked if she wanted to step outside, but she shook her head. She said she needed to finish the simulation already laid out on the floor. It was the same scenario that had played out in the Atlantic. She wanted to see every detail. She wanted to understand every step that led to the disaster. But more than anything, she wanted the officer running the exercise that day to see exactly what the doctrine had cost. She walked back to the painted floor. Morrison stood at the edge, confused by her expression but ready to continue. She set her submarine markers with deliberate care. She moved them according to the same timings and angles used by German commanders in the real attack. The escort screen stretched wide at the start, just as it had on the ocean. She waited for the moment when Morrison reacted to the exposed marker, and when he did, she watched the predictable pattern unfold again. 2 escorts chased her submarine. She marked the gap. She slipped her second submarine inside. She placed red markers beside several merchant ships. When Morrison argued that she was being too aggressive, she looked at him steadily and told him that her brother had died following the tactics he had just used. The words stunned him into silence. The room felt colder. Even Roberts did not move. There was no anger in her voice, only a quiet certainty built from 8 months of watching identical failures. The simulation ended with more red markers than white ones. A convoy without protection, a pattern without escape. Later that afternoon, Janet stayed alone in the pit. She replayed the real convoy on the floor, with chalk and ship markers, matching the times from the official report. The gaps formed in the same places. The attacks came at the same hours. The escorts made the same decisions that she had shown in the simulations months earlier, and the Wolfpack used the same tactics she had explained in every report she submitted. Nothing had changed. The Admiralty had seen her warnings and done nothing. She realized then that it would take more than documents or meetings to break the tradition that ruled the Royal Navy. Someone with true authority had to witness the truth with their own eyes. Right here on the painted floor, she needed to bring the most powerful officer in the Western approaches into the basement and make him command a convoy as she sank it. Not to humiliate him, but to force a change strong enough to save lives. It was the only way to stop another SC-121 from happening. March 3rd, 1943 arrived, with a grey Liverpool morning, and the distant sound of ships moving in the docks. Inside Derby House, the pit was colder than usual. Chalk dust clung to the edges of the floor map, and the models were arranged with clean precision. Janet stood near the table, hands steady, eyes focused. She had not slept much, but her purpose was clearer than ever. This day was going to decide whether the Royal Navy changed its tactics or kept repeating deadly mistakes. Captain Roberts moved briskly, checking stopwatches, adjusting scenario notes, and clearing space along the edges of the floor. His expression carried something between tension and hope. They had invited Admiral Max Horton, the man who commanded the entire Western approaches, the man who could force the Navy to adopt new tactics with a single order. Getting him to accept the invitation had not been easy. Convincing him to participate in a simulation run by young women was even harder, but he had agreed. Curiosity, pride, and his reputation as a decisive leader had brought him here. At 8:47, footsteps echoed down the concrete stairs. Officers straightened automatically. Horton entered with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades at sea. He studied the pit for a long moment. His uniform was crisp. His gaze was sharp. He did not dismiss the place, but he did not seem convinced by it either. He greeted Roberts politely, nodded toward the staff, and glanced at Janet with clear curiosity. She felt her heartbeat quicken, but she did not look away. Roberts began the briefing. He explained the scenario: 50 merchant ships, 8 escort destroyers, winter conditions, limited visibility. He pointed out the painted grids, the model ships, the markers for submarines. Horton listened without interruption. When Roberts offered him the chance to observe a demonstration first, Horton shook his head. He said he wanted to command the escorts personally. He wanted to see if these floor tactics could actually beat him. There was no arrogance in his voice. It was simply confidence. Confidence built from years of hunting submarines during the last war. Confidence in the doctrine he had been raised in. He stepped to the edge of the map and studied the convoy layout with a careful eye. Janet and another Wren, Jean Laidlaw, prepared their submarine markers. They had spent 8 months perfecting the patterns that German Wolfpack commanders used. They knew every timing, every weakness, every gap that appeared when escorts relied on aggressive pursuit. Roberts gave the signal to begin. The first minutes passed quietly. Horton placed his escorts exactly as tradition demanded. Wide arc, sweeping outward, covering large areas with movement instead of dense protection. But Janet recognized the same weaknesses she had seen dozens of times. She waited until the right moment, then moved her lead submarine marker into a position where it could be seen. She did not hide. She exposed it deliberately, knowing what the escorts would do. Horton reacted quickly, his voice calm, his movements sharp. One destroyer pushed forward to chase the submarine. Janet watched it leave the ring. She started a silent count in her mind. 30 seconds. 1 minute. More. When the destroyer committed fully to the chase, she placed her second submarine at the edge of the widening gap. Jean moved her own marker into a second gap, forming on the opposite side. The convoy remained steady in the center, unaware of the invisible predators slipping closer. Horton tried to adjust. He ordered another escort to cover the first gap. But the moment that ship shifted, Janet placed her third submarine to exploit the new opening. It was like watching gears turn in slow motion. Every action created a new weakness. Every chase opened another door. The escorts began to stretch apart, losing the tight ring that protected the merchant ships. Then the attacks began. A red chalk line swept across the painted blue sea. Janet followed with another. Roberts called out the simulated times, recording every hit. Horton responded with discipline, pulling escorts back in an attempt to regroup, but the submarines were already inside the formation. They attacked from angles he could not cover, without leaving more openings behind. The room grew tense. Officers leaned forward. Watches ticked. The heater hummed softly in the background. Janet moved her submarine pieces with quiet precision. She felt no anger, no triumph, no personal satisfaction. She was simply showing the truth she had carried for months, the truth that had cost her brother his life. The chalk marks spread across the convoy, each one representing a ship that would have burned in real water by 10 o'clock. The simulation was nearing its end. Horton stood with his arms behind his back, jaw tight, eyes scanning the red markers that now covered the merchant ships. A final coordinated attack by Janet and Jean struck at 10:01. When the last marker was placed, the convoy was devastated. 17 merchant ships destroyed. Not one submarine sunk. The room went silent. Horton did not speak right away. He studied the board, walking slowly around the edges, examining the chalk patterns with the seriousness of a man reviewing real battle damage. Janet stood still, chalk in hand, watching him. She felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from the weight of everything this moment represented. If he dismissed the simulation, nothing would change. If he accepted it, thousands of lives could be saved. Roberts began to speak, but Horton raised one hand. The room went quiet again. He looked at the young women who had sunk his convoy. He looked at the escorts, stretched thin across the map, and then he spoke with a steady voice that carried through the entire pit. "This works. Teach every commander." The words released something inside Janet. Only a quiet understanding that the battle was finally shifting. Her brother's death could not be changed, but the doctrine that killed him could be replaced, and it was going to begin here, in this cold basement, with chalk still clinging to her fingers. The day after Admiral Horton gave his order, Derby House changed. It felt as if someone had thrown open a door that had been locked for years. Officers who once treated the pit like an interesting experiment now entered with the seriousness of men preparing for combat. Messages travelled through the Western Approach's headquarters with new urgency. Every escort commander, no matter his rank or experience, was to report to the Western Approach's tactical unit for retraining. Not eventually. Not when convenient. Immediately. By the end of the first week, the pit was crowded in a way Janet had never seen before. Officers from destroyers, corvettes, and frigates arrived from Liverpool, Belfast, Londonderry, and even ships that had just returned from the Atlantic. Some walked in curious. Others walked in annoyed, convinced they had nothing to learn from chalk and stopwatches. A few wore thin smiles that suggested they expected to prove the simulations wrong, but none of them left the same way they arrived. Roberts organized the training into sessions that ran from morning to evening. Each class began with a briefing about German wolfpack tactics. The instructors, mostly young women in blue WRNS uniforms, explained how submarines coordinated, how they shadowed convoys, how they exploited gaps left by chasing escorts. Some officers listened with interest. Others leaned back with crossed arms, skeptical. But then the simulation began, and skepticism melted fast. Janet watched many of these men face the same realization she had shown Morrison and Harrison months earlier. She set her submarine markers quietly and waited for the moment an escort rushed away. Without fail, it happened. Sometimes within minutes, sometimes a bit longer, but it always happened. and the moment a gap opened, Jean, or another Wren, slipped through and marked an attack. The chalk lines grew faster than the officers could respond. Red markers spread across the board. Torpedo strikes multiplied. Convoys crumbled. At the end of each run, the officers stood stunned, staring at the damage they had allowed. Their pride bent, then broke, and finally transformed into understanding. One officer, a tall man from a Canadian escort group, insisted during his briefing that aggressive hunting saved lives. When the simulation ended 40 minutes later, more than half his convoy was gone. He walked around the floor for a long time, silent, studying each marker. He finally turned to Janet and asked her to explain exactly where he had lost control. She knelt beside him, tracing the chalk lines step by step. When she finished, he nodded slowly. His voice was quiet when he said he understood, and even quieter when he admitted he had made the same mistake at sea. He left the pit already planning to change his tactics. Not every officer accepted the lesson easily. A few grew frustrated. Some raised their voices. One man accused the simulation of favoring the submarines. Roberts responded calmly by pulling out German war reports that showed identical patterns in real combat. The room quieted quickly after that. The truth did not need force. It only needed to be shown clearly. As the days passed, new tactics began to take shape. The Wrens refined them through hundreds of simulations. They memorized distances, angles, and time intervals so precisely that their work looked almost like choreography. When they discovered a tactic that consistently blocked submarine approaches, they named it Raspberry. It used coordinated star shells to light the entire perimeter in less than 2 minutes, denying submarines the shadows they relied on. When they mapped likely U-boat positions before contact even occurred, Jean created the beta search. It allowed escorts to predict where submarines would move and force them under before they could attack. Pineapple was born during a chaotic simulation when several submarines attacked at once. The escorts weaved in overlapping patterns that created a moving wall of protection. Step Aside came later, designed to break the tracking system of new German acoustic torpedoes. None of these tactics came from textbooks or from the Admiralty. They came from chalk lines traced across the pit by young women who studied patterns with mathematical focus. Each tactic was tested, refined, and repeated until officers could perform it without hesitation, and the results appeared almost immediately in the real Atlantic. At sea, escorts that once scattered now held formation with disciplined precision. Commanders who once chased distant contacts stayed tight around their convoys. They used Raspberry to light the night sky. They used beta search to corner submarines. They used Pineapple to stop coordinated attacks before they began. Convoys that would have lost 10 ships now lost none. German captains reported that some escort screens were impossible to penetrate. They described them as iron rings, unbreakable barriers that forced submarines to withdraw. The shift was so dramatic that the U-boat fleet suffered its worst month of the entire war in May 1943. 41 submarines were lost. Germany called it Black May. The wolfpacks that had once ruled the Atlantic were suddenly hunted, blinded, and outmaneuvered. Convoy after convoy reached Britain safely, carrying the supplies that kept the nation alive. All across the western approaches, the effect was felt like a turning tide. Janet heard these reports in passing as officers briefed Roberts and updated the training staff. She simply noted the numbers, recognized the patterns, and returned to the pit to train the next group of officers. Britain still needed every convoy, and every commander had to master the new methods before leaving port. But sometimes, late at night when the pit was empty, she allowed herself to rest her hand on the chalk-covered floor and imagine the ships sailing safely through the dark. Nothing ever could. But she knew now that the pattern that killed him had been broken, and she had helped break it. By the summer of 1943, the pit no longer felt like a lonely basement hidden beneath Derby House. It had become a place where the future of the Atlantic changed hour by hour. Convoys that once faced near certain destruction now sailed with a level of safety that no one had believed possible only months before. Reports arrived daily, each one showing the same pattern. Losses were falling. Escorts were coordinating more effectively. Submarines that once roamed with confidence were now forced underwater or driven away before they could attack. They cleaned chalk off the floor, rearranged the ship models, timed movements with stopwatches until their fingers stiffened, and ran simulations late into the evening. Janet trained officers who had commanded ships longer than she had been alive. She spoke softly and clearly, explaining the importance of timing, formation, and discipline. Some commanders admitted that her voice stayed with them during real escort runs, reminding them not to chase distant contacts or abandon their protective lines. By early 1944, the effect of the new tactics became impossible to ignore. German after-action reports, gathered from captured submarines and intercepted messages, revealed frustration and confusion. U-boat commanders complained that convoys were no longer vulnerable. They described tight screens they could not penetrate, escorts that refused to separate, and search patterns that forced them underwater before they could set up attacks. They wrote that the Allied escort method had become too efficient and too unpredictable. What they did not know was that the method had been designed on a painted floor by young women who few outside Derby House had ever heard of. When the final major Wolfpack operations collapsed in mid-1944, the Admiralty credited new technology, improved aerial patrols, and better intelligence. All of these had played a part, but the turning point, the moment when the Battle of the Atlantic finally shifted toward Allied control, had begun months earlier with chalk dust and pattern recognition. Janet knew this. Roberts knew this. The officers trained in the pit knew it as well. But credit was not something the Wrens expected. They had been sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act. Their names would not appear in reports. Their contributions would not travel beyond the basement where they had worked for nearly 3 years. After the war ended in 1945, Derby House slowly emptied. The maps remained, but the tension that once filled the air faded. The ocean that had once threatened Britain with starvation calmed. Janet packed her few belongings and left the pit without ceremony. She walked up the same narrow stairs she had descended every morning and stepped into the sunlight of a world that no longer needed her calculations to survive. She married 2 years later, started a small family, and became a mathematics teacher. Her students never knew she had once run simulations that shaped naval warfare. She did not tell them. She did not tell her neighbors or even her own children. The secrecy of Watu had become a part of her life, something she carried quietly, like a folded note in a pocket. She lived simply and modestly, the way many veterans lived when the world moved on and no longer asked for their strength. For decades, almost no one outside the Navy understood what had happened inside Derby House. Books about the Battle of the Atlantic focused on the Enigma codebreakers, on new radar systems, on convoy escorts and famous captains. The women of Watu appeared only as footnotes, described as assistants who helped run exercises. Their tactical innovations were listed under anonymous terms like staff-developed procedures or experimental methods. The impact remained hidden in classified files. Then in 1974, some of the records were finally released. Historians searching through dusty boxes found unfamiliar diagrams, chalk patterns, and detailed reports written in clear handwriting. They found simulation logs that matched real convoy battles. They found tactical instructions that appeared months before they were officially adopted. They found notes signed by the same young women whose names had barely appeared in naval histories. It took until 1998 for a full study to calculate the true effect of the Watu innovations. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of merchant ships reached Britain safely because escorts stopped chasing submarines. Tens of thousands of sailors survived because convoy screens stayed tight. German U-boats suffered catastrophic losses because the Wolfpack strategy no longer worked. And behind these results was the same pattern repeated again and again across the simulation logs. Janet's handwriting, Janet's calculations, Janet's predicted outcomes. When journalists finally contacted her for interviews, she was 73 years old. She spoke quietly, giving credit to Captain Roberts and the other Wrens. She said the pit had been a team effort. She never mentioned the day she sank Admiral Horton's convoy in 47 minutes. She never discussed how her brother's death had driven her to change the doctrine that had taken his life. She had learned long ago that victory did not always appear in headlines or medals. Sometimes it lived in the spaces no one saw. Janet passed away in 2009. Her obituary mentioned her service in the Women's Royal Naval Service, but offered no details. It did not name Derby House or the Western Approaches Tactical Unit. It did not say that her work helped shape naval doctrine used around the world even today. But if someone walks through the National Maritime Museum and stops at the small Watteau exhibit, they can see a photograph of the pit taken in 1943. 11 young women stand around the painted floor. One of them, third from the left, holds a piece of chalk and looks directly into the camera with calm determination. The caption does not explain everything. It does not need to. The truth rests in the chalk dust on her hands, in the patterns she saw that others missed, and in the thousands of sailors who reached home because of a quiet girl who refused to let doctrine stand unchallenged.